Okay, let's dive in. You might feel like the conversation around gender is changing constantly.
It really does feel that way sometimes.
And our sources for this deep dive, especially one called Evolving Gender Dynamics in Modern Society, they really lean into that. They sort of challenge us to look beyond the familiar binary.
Right, to see what's actually shifting beneath the surface.
Our mission today is, well, to cut through some of the noise, maybe. Find the most important takeaways from these sources.
And figure out why it's all happening so fast and what it actually means for you listening.
Exactly.
So we're going to unpack the key concepts, trace some fascinating shifts, really.
And explore the implications across society. This isn't about starting from scratch, is it?
No, not at all. It's about using the material we have to deepen our understanding of a topic many of us are already thinking about.
Okay, so right off the bat, these sources talk about gender dynamics. What exactly are we talking about there? Why is it such a hot topic now?
Well, the material defines it as the complex ways gender identities influence things.
Influence what sort of things?
Relationships, power structures, roles in society, even access to resources. Think about those traditional expectations.
Placed on people just because they were seen as male or female.
Exactly. The sources explore how those expectations shape, almost everything. Family life, boardrooms, you name it.
And they make a really crucial point, don't they? That while we've historically thought in a simple male-female binary,
That model is really being questioned, reshaped.
and they distinguish gender largely a social construct, they say, from biological sex.
Yeah, that distinction is fundamental in these sources. Sex refers to biological attributes. Gender, on the other hand, is presented as a social construct.
So roles, behaviors, identity.
Right, what a society associates with different genders. And what's fascinating and what the sources highlight is how quickly those ideas, masculinity, femininity, can change, often driven by big social or economic shifts.
So why does understanding that evolution matter so much for us today?
Well, because people are expressing their identities in more diverse ways than ever before. The sources argue that understanding these dynamics is just essential
Essential for what?
for fostering empathy, inclusion, respect, basically in any setting. Your workplace, schools, even just, talking with friends. It helps us interact effectively in a world that's just much more openly diverse now.
That makes sense. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. How did we even get those rigid traditional roles in the first place? What's the history tell us, according to the sources?
The history is really eye-opening. The material points out that gender roles weren't always what the Western world came to see as traditional.
Really? Oh, so?
Well, some indigenous cultures, for instance, had much more fluid understandings of gender. They recognized multiple identities, beyond just male and female.
That's quite a different starting point than what many of us learn.
It really reframes the idea that a strict binary is somehow natural or inevitable. Contrast that with the West, where the sources note the Industrial Revolution played a huge role.
In solidifying roles.
Massively. Men moved into factory jobs, became the sole breadwinners. Women were increasingly confined to the home. That economic shift basically constructed a new, much stricter gender binary in practice.
And we still see echoes of those rigid roles today, obviously, but some places are moving faster than others.
Absolutely. Look at Sweden, which the material mentions, officially recognizing gender-neutral pronouns, baking equality into policy.
But the sources acknowledge it's not like that everywhere.
Right. They acknowledge the pace varies globally. Change might be slower, where tradition is very strong, but the movement towards recognizing a broader spectrum is, it's happening, it's undeniable, even if it looks different everywhere.
This leads us nicely into some key moments that really push back against those norms. The sources list some milestones in the equality movement.
Right, you can trace this through really significant events. The material highlights Seneca Falls in 1848.
The first women's rights convention in the U.S.
Exactly, a foundational moment. Then the hard-won fight for U.S. women getting the vote in 1920.
And then jumping ahead a bit into the later 20th century.
The sources point to the 60s and 70s, second wave feminism, pushing for legal equity, workplace rights, reproductive freedom.
Big changes.
Huge. And then more recently, the 2000s onwards. The rise of LGBTQ plus rights, much greater trans visibility, and movements like #MeToo that have had such an impact.
And the material frames these not just as asking for equal rights within the system.
Precisely. But as fundamentally challenging the underlying gender norms themselves, expanding the whole conversation way beyond just a simple binary.
Okay, here's where the sources introduce a concept that feels absolutely essential for getting this. intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's work.
Yes, this is critical because it stops us looking at gender in isolation. The sources explain intersectionality is about how your different social identities, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, etc., overlap.
They intersect with gender.
Right, and those intersections create unique experiences. You can't just add them up, they combine in specific ways.
Creating different kinds of discrimination or privilege.
Exactly. Yeah. The material uses that powerful example. A black woman might experience gender discrimination very differently than a white woman because her experience is shaped by both race and gender intersecting.
And recognizing that is key for policy.
Vital. The sources stress. It's not just academic. You need to see those layered realities to build policies and social norms that actually work for everyone, that address discrimination effectively.
It feels like media plays such a huge part here, either reinforcing old ideas or challenging them.
Oh, absolutely. Media is incredibly powerful in shaping how we see gender. The sources talk about traditional portrayals.
Like classic Disney princesses, or maybe early Marvel heroes.
Exactly. Often reinforcing very narrow stereotypes, right? Women as passive, emotional, nurturing, men as stoic, strong, dominant.
Which really limits everyone, doesn't it?
It does. But the good news, according to the sources, is that newer content is actively pushing back. They mention shows like Euphoria, Sex Education, content that portrays much more complex, diverse gender identities and experiences. And that sparks conversations, challenges those old molds.
Okay, let's drill down on something that often trips people up. The difference between gender identity and gender expression. Can we clarify that based on the sources?
Yes, definitely. It's a fundamental distinction the sources make clear. Gender identity is your internal sense of self.
Deeply personal.
Yeah.
Who you feel you are.
Exactly. Whether you feel male, female, both, neither, somewhere else entirely. It's inside you.
Okay. And gender expression.
That's how you outwardly show your gender, how you present it to the world.
Through clothes, hair, behavior, voice.
All those external signals.
Yeah.
And the sources emphasize that these two things, your internal identity and your outward expression, don't always line up with societal expectations.
Or even with the sex assigned at birth.
Right. They don't have to match what society expects based on your assigned sex.
Does the material give an example?
Yeah, a clear one. Someone assigned female at birth might identify internally as non-binary,
Okay.
and they might express their gender in ways considered traditionally masculine. The sources note that while society is getting maybe a bit more accepting of this range,
It can still be challenging.
definitely, navigating a world still largely built on those traditional norms can be really tough.
So, how does all this actually show up in our daily lives? The sources look at specific areas. Let's start with the workplace. How are these dynamics playing out there?
Well, the material highlights that even with progress, disparities are still very real.
Like the gender pay gap.
Exactly. Women often earning less than men for similar work, still happening. And underrepresentation.
Fewer women or non-binary folks in leadership roles.
Right. Plus, things like lack of paid paternity leave often subtly reinforce those old traditional family roles.
So what are companies doing? Anything mentioned in the sources?
Yeah, they talk about DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Things like bias training.
That and more inclusive policies may be around dress codes, parental leave for all parents, and mentorship programs. The material actually links prioritizing gender equity directly to better company performance and keeping employees.
Interesting. What about education? How is this playing out in schools?
Well, historically, schools often reinforce the binary pretty clearly.
Through things like uniforms or splitting up activities by gender.
Yes, exactly. And curricula often just overlooked contributions from women or LGBTQ plus people altogether.
That's changing now.
The sources describe a definite shift towards more inclusive approaches. Things like gender-neutral restrooms, using inclusive language in the classroom.
And actually talking about identity.
Yes, dedicating time to discuss gender identity and respect in an age-appropriate way, of course. The material even notes that kids can grasp gender diversity concepts.
Which builds empathy, presumably.
Right, and these efforts, the sources argue, are crucial for making all students feel seen, feel valued.
Technology seems like a double-edged sword here. A tool, but also maybe a challenge.
That's a good way to put it. The sources point out how platforms like TikTok, Instagram, they let people explore identity, find support online. That can be incredibly validating.
But there are risks.
Oh, definitely. Significant ones. The material warns about algorithmic bias.
Meaning AI systems built on binary assumptions?
Yeah, things like facial recognition that might just fail to recognize non-binary people. And then there's the huge issue of online harassment, which hits gender-diverse users really hard.
So the sources call for
Developing ethical AI, for inclusive tech policies, basically trying to address these harms.
What about mental health? Constantly navigating rigid norms must take a toll.
The sources are very clear on that. Rigid expectations, they take a significant toll.
How so?
Well, men might feel pressure to suppress emotions, hide vulnerability, leading to unaddressed mental health issues. Women can face intense anxiety from societal pressures about appearance, behavior.
And non-binary or trans individuals.
The material notes that discrimination, feeling isolated, it can severely impact mental well-being. It's a major stressor.
Is the mental health field catching up at all?
The sources do highlight the growth of gender-affirming therapy.
Providing safe spaces.
Crucial safe spaces, yes. For people to explore their identities and experiences with actual professional support. That's a positive development mentioned.
And family structures themselves, they seem to be really reshaping too.
Definitely. The material points to, the rise of stay-at-home dads challenging old roles, dual-income households, co-parenting becoming more the norm.
And then beyond that.
A really big shift is coming from non-binary and LGBTQ plus parents. They're actively redefining traditional roles and even terms like mother and father.
Which means our systems need to adapt.
Exactly. These changes, the sources argue, mean we need new frameworks in law, healthcare, education. They all need to catch up to reflect these evolving families.
That brings us neatly to the broader legal and political landscape. It sounds incredibly varied across the globe.
It really is. The sources mention progressive places like Canada, Germany. They're leading by allowing a third gender option on official documents.
But that's not the case everywhere.
Far from it. They contrast this with regions, even specific states within the U.S., that are actually enacting restrictive laws. Laws targeting gender identity.
So it's a real battleground.
Very much so.
Yeah.
The material frames the ongoing advocacy, the legal fights. Yep. They're actively shaping this landscape. It's constantly shifting, pushing, and pulling on recognition and rights.
The sources specifically mention young people, Gen Z, as playing a big role.
Yes, the material really points to Gen Z as driving rapid change. They're significantly more likely to identify outside the non-binary, gender fluid.
And they're vocal about it.
Very vocal. Advocates for inclusive language, better representation. They use platforms like YouTube, Reddit, TikTok to share experiences, build community.
So the message for adults is?
Pay attention. The sources emphasize that educators, parents, policymakers have to recognize this generational shift and figure out how to support these young people.
Of course, with change this fast, there's bound to be resistance. The sources address that too, right?
Oh yes, they don't shy away from it. They acknowledge resistance exists.
Where does it come from?
Often rooted in cultural or religious beliefs, maybe misinformation, sometimes just fear of the unknown, or even economic and political interests trying to maintain the status quo.
So how do we bridge those divides, according to the material?
It suggests constructive dialogue, education, and really trying to cultivate empathy, trying to understand where people are coming from, even if you disagree.
Okay, so for someone listening right now, maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed, but wanting to understand better, wanting to be supportive, what practical steps do the sources suggest?
They offer some really clear, actionable advice. First, educate yourself.
Read, listen.
Read, listen to different perspectives, maybe follow some thought leaders online, attend a workshop if you can. Second, listen actively. Really listen to the experiences of people with diverse gender identities.
And language is important.
Crucial. Third point, be mindful of your language. Use inclusive terms. Ask for pronouns if you're unsure, don't assume. Use alternatives like everyone, folks, parent, or they when you don't know someone's gender or you're talking generally. The FAQs attached to the source material really emphasize that.
What else?
Fourth, challenge gender stereotypes when you see or hear them. Don't just let them slide. And finally, be an active ally.
Yeah.
Use your voice to support marginalized people. Speak up against discrimination when you see it. Don't be a bystander.
Looking ahead then, what does the material predict? Where is this all heading?
What the sources predict, the pace of change is likely to keep accelerating.
Okay.
They foresee, for example, increasing global legal recognition for non-binary and gender-fluid identities, following the lead of places like New Zealand, Canada.
What about healthcare?
More inclusive healthcare policies, covering things like reproductive care, mental health support specifically for gender-diverse individuals.
Anything else stand out?
The material even suggests the potential for mandatory gender studies in education someday, and developing ethical frameworks for AI and tech. specifically designed to ensure fair treatment for all gender identities.
Wow. It really does feel like we're in the middle of a fundamental shift in how society understands gender.
I think we are. The material makes it really clear that gender dynamics aren't fixed. They're evolving rapidly, and they influence nearly every part of our lives.
So navigating this takes.
Openness, empathy, and definitely a commitment to keep learning. It's not just about, keeping up with the latest terms. It's about actively participating in building a more inclusive world.
Right. That leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to consider, pulling from everything we've discussed from these sources. Given this accelerating pace of change, driven by tech, by activism, how might future generations keep reshaping things we currently take for granted? Basic societal structures, concepts.
The big question.
It is. And maybe more personally, what does truly embracing this fluidity require from you in your daily interactions, in your own understanding? Something to think about.